Hi there, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is hopefully more practical, accessible, and more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be riffing about validity and reliability of the data you're collecting, and I'm going to share some strategies with you that will help you enhance the validity and reliability of the data that you're collecting. When people start to talk about validity and reliability, they often use those two words in the same sentence. They don't ever separate them. And I was running a workshop in an organisation 2 days ago, and it was one of the first questions I was asked. We were talking about data storytelling, we were talking about building staff and employee members' data literacy and how important that was. And somebody, and this has happened plenty of times before, and somebody put their hand up and they said, "But Selena, if I don't trust the data that I'm being given, then how do I use it? And why should I be expected to use it if I don't actually trust it to begin with?" Now, it's a really valid point. And for those people who are fearful of data and they really kind of struggle with the idea of using it or are not sure how to use it, one of their almost default thinking patterns that they have around data is around the issues with it. And while we want to obviously minimize those issues and those errors and the challenges with data, the reality is that they absolutely exist. And so in our roles, it's really important that we're actively seeking out ways to, reduce the impact of some of those challenges to make the data more trustworthy, which hopefully then means that our staff are actually more likely to use it. One of the key and most foundational elements of trust that people have in our data really does come back to the reliability and validity of the information that they are being given. Now, I just want to talk about those two things separately for a little bit. As I said, most people use them almost interchangeably, but they are actually different. Reliability is when we talk about, or it refers to, the consistency of a measure. Can we actually, if we were to reproduce that test, if we were to recollect that data, if we were to survey similar people in the future, would we actually be able to reproduce the same results under the same conditions? If you think about your scales at home, if you were to stand on the scales and see how much you weighed and then stepped off and then stepped back on again and weighed yourself a second time and then stepped off and you stepped on again for a third time, if your scales are telling you the same value each time that you do that, then they're really reliable. And we would certainly hope that that's the case and it's not a different number each time you step off and back onto the scales. Issues with reliability in data collection really come into play with qualitative data and when humans are involved in the collection. We know one of the awesome things about our human brains is that they are very subjective and that they really differ. And we want to make sure that the people who are collecting this data for us are doing things in a really similar way. So it doesn't matter which person the client is interacting with, for example, they are going to be giving the same answers because they're being asked the same questions in a really similar way. I know one of the challenges I had in my work when I was a middle leader around reliability was the fact that I used to be observed in my practice, and we were observed and there was 9 different categories that we got a score in. And in 8 out of 9 categories, I scored outstanding, and in 1 category, I was given good. And the person who was actually observing me said to me, he said, "Well, even though you got 8 out of 9 as outstanding and 1 as good, I'm giving you an overall result of good because I actually didn't see outstanding often enough. I needed to see it in every single category for you to be deemed to be an outstanding employee." So I just thought, well, that's a bit of a joke. I'm just going to assume that I was outstanding because 8 out of 9 is pretty good. But the bigger issue in terms of the trust for me as a measurement of my performance as an employee was that I knew that if any other person had come and observed me and given me the same results for each one of those categories, every single time they would have classified me as an outstanding employee. Unfortunately, it never happened. That was as close as I ever got. I'm not bitter, I promise. I just wanted to jump into validity now, and that's a little bit different. So validity relates to how accurate a measure is. So it's in some ways it's broader than reliability, but it relates more so to do the metrics that we're collecting, do they actually measure what we think they are? And are they representing what we are hoping that they do? Is the data collection and the data type actually really appropriate for our analysis and appropriate for our inquiry? Oftentimes, it's really hard to know what the most appropriate types of data are, or sometimes we just have the data that we're given and we don't have a lot of other options, and we're trying to, I guess, find connections and draw dots. And sometimes we draw too long a bow between what the data is telling us and what we're hoping to find out from it. If we want to check in on the validity of data on products that we're selling, and we want to know where we're selling most products around the world, then it's fair to say that if we're looking at the shipping destinations and the postcodes of where we're sending our products to, that's probably a really valid and useful set of data that is highly appropriate for the questions that we have and the hypothesis that we want to test, because it is absolutely going to tell us definitively where our product's selling really well and the areas in which it's not. On the other hand, I've seen organisations and I've worked with organisations where they've, I guess, extrapolated a little bit too far from some of the data that they've collected. I worked with a team where they said to me they were reporting back on their customer satisfaction, and they were saying to me that their customers are really satisfied with the service that they receive from their company. And they were saying, on average, the scores that we get for customer service are 4.6 out of 5. Now, that's a really great statistic to know. But on digging, I found out that the data that they were actually using to make that call about whether or not customers were satisfied with the customer service was actually the product review data. So people were being asked to review the product that they had bought from the company, and the company was then extrapolating that further to kind of say, well, if they're happy with the product, then they must be happy with us. And so the same metric applies. And it doesn't. It's a different metric. We could be exceptionally happy with a product that we bought, and we might not have had very good customer service at all. In fact, it could have been really horrendous. And likewise, we could have had a really bad experience with a product. It might have arrived broken, but when we contacted the company, they were really responsive, they were great to deal with, and they offered to send out a replacement straight away at no additional cost. So we actually need to ask two different things. If we want to know whether a customer is happy with the product, we need to ask them that. And if we want to know whether they're happy with their customer service, we need to ask them that as well. So that's kind of the main issues with validity, is when one thing is asked or when one type of data is used and it's extrapolated or drawn out further to make assumptions about other elements of the business. This is obviously really problematic because there are often so many different factors that contribute to all of these kind of different elements that we're investigating in our businesses. So if we want to know something really specific, we need the most specific and most appropriate data for that. A schools example that comes to mind for me, and I just recently had a conversation with a mate of mine who is a head teacher in the UK, and we were talking about performance-based pay in the UK. And so some teachers are paid on performance-based pay depending on the results that students get. And that's really problematic. So teachers are using the number of students who are getting A stars, A's, B's, C's, etc. Their pass rates are being attached to the pay that teachers are getting. And while teachers can absolutely help students succeed and help students flourish and can help them get some amazing results, at the end of the day, there are so many factors that contribute to that young person's performance, and there are so many circumstances and elements that are totally out of control of the teacher. So is it the most appropriate use of the data to actually say, well, we're going to pay our staff based on that output? I would argue that it's not the most appropriate measure of whether or not the teacher's doing a really good job. I would also say that 8 out of 9 is also outstanding, but as I said, not bitter. But it's not the most appropriate measure. If we want to talk about employee quality in whatever way, shape or form that looks like, then an output produced by another human being with a whole lot of other contributing factors is probably not the most appropriate and therefore not the most valid type of data that we could be using to make that decision. So as I said at the beginning, both validity and reliability are two themes that come up all the time. They are separate, they are different, and I hope that those examples have kind of unpacked that difference a little bit. But either way, both really play into this piece around whether or not people trust the data. And as I mentioned, if they're not trusting of the data that they're being given, they're certainly not likely to then go to engage with the data well or effectively, and they're probably not going to use it to make decisions. You think that if you were given data from another department or from another team or from a data source or a different platform, and you had questions about whether or not that data could consistently be collected in the same way, or whether it was actually appropriate or the most appropriate thing that you could have collected, you're probably going to have questions about it too. So whatever role we're in, we can really kind of start to actively either ask questions about the validity and reliability of the data we're being given, and we can seek to put into place some strategies, I guess, that enhance the validity and the reliability. The reliability piece, I mean, that's about consistency. And so therefore our strategies are about consistency. We need people asking really similar questions. We need them doing it in a very similar way. We want to be collecting the same types of data from all of our customers or all of our clients, because we don't want to be comparing apples with oranges. We want to make sure that the collection tools that we're using and the people that we're using to clean up some of our data, that they're also doing a really good job. I recently realized in my email newsletter list that there was a whole lot of people that had actually been misgrouped and miscategorized into corporates and not-for-profits who shouldn't have been in that category. I also had people in my newsletter list who had been put into the wrong states and territories and the wrong parts of the world. And so again, for me, I can't trust where those people are coming from or what proportion of people I have on different lists if that data is wrong to begin with. And that was human error. That was somebody had kind of messed up my database, which I've learned my lesson and we're moving on. But anyway, I have far more consistent practices in place from here on in. As I said, validity is much broader and it's not as specific as reliability, because we can test reliability really easily and we can keep checking, particularly with numbers. We can just keep checking whether or not we're producing the same or very similar results over and over again. Validity is much broader, and I guess this is just the chance to really think about, does the data that you're collecting actually do what you need it to do? If it doesn't, then how do we actually get decent data that it's a better reflection? What would be a better reflection for you, and what would actually help you in your role more and would be more specific and more targeted than the information that you're given or that you're collecting at the moment? So once this episode ends and you go back to your world and you're back at work, and in a couple of months' time when you hear people throwing around the terms validity and reliability, I really want you to pause and think about what those two things mean and how they actually are different, and they're two challenges that we need to face and address head on. Remember, reliability is to do with consistency. Can we reproduce it? Validity is it appropriate? Does it tell us what we actually think it is meant to be telling us? If we understand that and we see or hear somebody questioning the validity and reliability of data sources, then we can talk to them about it and we can talk them through some of those strategies. More importantly, though, if you have somebody who is complaining about validity and reliability of the data, as I said, that's often a bit of a fear response and people question it. We actually need to have the confidence to really lean into that conversation and open up, I guess, the floor for people to talk about the validity and reliability. I was working with a team a few years ago, and every team at the beginning of each year was given data from the previous team that had worked with those clients. And so there's kind of this data movement that happens through the organization, and it's just passed on from year to year. And every single group of employees were saying to me, I don't trust last year's information. I don't trust the data that I'm being handed. It's not valid and reliable. And so I feel like I have to start again and do all of the data collection again to just work out, where we're starting off. And then I can make some judgments from that. I just don't trust it. And it was really fascinating because every single group told me that. And I was like, well, you can't all be wrong. So let's actually just have an uncomfortable conversation about the fact that we do want data that we can trust, that we can action, that we know is actually doing what we intend, and that if another person was to go and collect it, or we change tools, that we would get a similar result. And we want to make sure that what we're collecting is actually doing what we set out for it to do for us, and we can use it in the way that we intend. So thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Make Data Talk. A text version of these episodes is now available on my Make Data Talk LinkedIn newsletter. So if you are interested in having a look at some text and being able to share that with your colleagues, feel free to head over there and take a look. While you're over there, feel free to connect with me. I'm at Dr. Selena Fisk on LinkedIn. Take care and look after yourself.